All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on China, Russia, and Central Asia. I'm John S. Van Oudenaaren, China Program Manager at the Jamestown Foundation and Editor-in-Chief of China Brief. We normally try to look for news hooks for topics, but this is a little bit of a broader picture topic and a dynamic that's been building for the last year and likely quite longer. Today we're going to look at a situation in Central Asia where we've seen it continue to occupy a central place in Chinese foreign policy, but take on a lesser role in Russian foreign policy as Russia is preoccupied with its conflict in Ukraine, conflict with Ukraine, I should say. Last September, Xi made his first visit outside China in over 2.5 years to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and to the head of states meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which underscores the importance of the region to Beijing. And this year at his National People's Press Conference, National People's Congress press conference, Foreign Minister Qin Gang stated that China would hold a China Central Asia States Summit later this year. And the heads of Central Asian states and Central Asian officials have reported receiving invitations from China to the summit already. All right, with that, we're going to turn to our two excellent visiting experts today who are going to talk.
We have a sound interruption, John.
Yeah, I think we've lost. There we go. Johnny.
Did I cut out for a second? Sorry, having some. All right.
Yes.
So we have Margarita Asanova. She is a senior fellow with me at the Jamestown Foundation here and writes frequently for Eurasia Daily Monitor publication. And then we have Raffaello Pentuti, and he's a senior fellow RSIS in Singapore and RUSI in the United Kingdom. So let's go to you first, Margarita, and you can talk us through the perspective on Central Asia and specifically the impact of the Ukraine war on, views on geopolitical dynamics in the region and beyond. Thanks, Margarita.
Thank you for having me today, John. Central Asia is a landlocked region, and this is the key ingredient of where the region stands and what the region does in terms of foreign policy, trade, economic development, and everything else that is related to a normal country that is independent, sovereign, and wants to become a prosperous one. So Central Asia is bordering, most of the countries are bordering Russia, some are bordering China, but pretty much squeezed in this landlocked region. Central Asia has very few options for transportation of goods, of energy, movement.
Oh.
Sorry?
You were cutting out there for a second. I think, can you try again? Okay.
Okay, yes, maybe the internet is not as good as we wanted it to be. So the fact that the Central Asian region is a landlocked region, with Uzbekistan being one of the two double landlocked countries in the world, limits its possibilities or opportunities for trade, for movement of goods, for transportation corridors of its energy, to very few options. On the one hand is Russia, the former colonist that colonized Central Asia for many years, starting from the Tsarist Empire. And on the other side, on the east and south side, is China, another big player in the world and in the region. So being squeezed between the Russian bear and the Chinese dragon, as very often Central Asians would tell you, is a very tricky business for this region. So it's trying to balance these two giants on two sides, with developing connections with other countries, mostly with Western Europe, with European Union and with United States. Of course, the investment opportunities are much closer to Russia and China in the region, not as close for the United States, although the United States has a very significant investments in Kazakhstan, over $62 billion in its energy sector and other sectors of the economy. So the war completely changed this equation. Russia, which was the main export route for Central Asian goods, now is not effectively working for them. Many ports in Russia cannot export goods to send to other countries in Europe because of unspoken ban, in addition to the sanctions, in addition to official embargoes. So Central Asian uranium, for example, that is enriched in Russia and exported through Russian ports, may have trouble, may be in trouble in the future. Export of oil from Central Asia has been suspended several times by Russia through the CPC, the Caspian Consortium pipeline, going through Russia last year for various reasons, actually various pretexts that Russia has put forward. In addition, the companies that exporting Kazakh oil had to provide documentation that this is not Russian oil and it can be exported to other countries without being subjected to any kind of embargo. So these opportunities are changing on the economic front. And China is, of course, stepping in and trying to take advantage of that potential vacuum that Russia is leaving. But Russia is also becoming weaker economically, exhausted by the war, needing all kinds of imports from countries that are more friendly to it. So Russia now needs Central Asia more than ever, and it's becoming the opposite situations. Russia needs Central Asia more than Central Asia needs Russia. But Central Asia has been threatened by Russia, especially Kazakhstan. In the last week alone, Kazakhstan was threatened twice by Russian propagandists because of Kazakhstan's very strong position against the recognition of the territories occupied by Russia as independent states or part of Russia, and because of the very clear opposition, very vocal opposition of the people of especially Kazakhstan, but other Central Asian states as well, to the war. There are several organizations that Russia has maintained its presence in Central Asia, claiming to be the main security guarantor of the region and allowing at the same time China to invest in the economies of these countries and play a leading economic role. And one of them, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, that has 6 members, pretty much became de facto redundant. At the moment, Central Asian states refuse to provide assistance to Russia for its war in Ukraine. They refuse to provide military assistance, but also other assistance to Russia to boost this effort. The Commonwealth of Independent States is another organization that became redundant at the moment. One of these independent states attacked another independent state, former Soviet state, Ukraine. And the Eurasian Economic Union is the third large organization that is still functioning, but it has to be very, Kazakhstan, which is a member of that organization, has to be restrained in what it exports to Russia because of the sanctions and the embargo on different goods and different materials. And at the same time, Kazakhstan can sell pretty much everything in Russia at the moment because the embargo allows Kazakhstan to become a net exporter to Russia versus a net importer as it used to be in the past. Russia maintained its influence in the region through Russian populations, but we have seen in the last 20, 25 years decline of those populations in numbers. Even in Kazakhstan now, the Russian population is 17%. We have to remember that at the beginning, 1991, when Central Asian states became independent, Kazakhs were not majority in their own country. There were different nationalities that were consisting the population of Kazakhstan. Now Kazakhs are majority, and Russian percentage is declining to under 20, and now it's 17%. There are a lot of Russians that found refuge in Kazakhstan to escape from the draft of civilians into the army as well. Presumably there are about 200,000 people who are still in Kazakhstan as a result. The other way Russia has maintained its security dominance over Central Asia is through its military bases in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. We are seeing also reducing of personnel of these bases as Russia needs more soldiers to the front in Ukraine. Another tool used was loans and infrastructure projects in the past, but this pretty much ended in 2015 when the oil prices went down and Russia stopped providing those loans and grants to Kyrgyzstan and other needed countries in the region. So that was a moment of big disappointment by these countries, and this was the moment when China stepped in with economic investments. But the biggest influence right now is the Russian language media, the Russian language entertainment, the analysis provided through Russian language sources, and the propaganda that is spreading in Central Asia through Russian sources. They're becoming less and less credible simply because people see what is happening in Ukraine, and they seem to have a lot more information about the truth of the war, Russia's war against Ukraine, than the Russian population has. So they have other access to other media, and they can read in translation what is happening in Ukraine. So their attitude is a lot more realistic, seeing that Russia is continuing its colonization project. And you can see in Kazakh media, and you can see in Uzbek media, we can see columns and about decolonization, about the need to become more Kazakh, more Uzbek, more sovereign, more independent from Russia, to seek alternative routes for goods such as the Middle Corridor through the Caspian and Azerbaijan and Georgia and Turkey to Europe, instead of depending entirely on Russia. But to sum it up, while Russia is losing its influence in Central Asia, I think Russia has lost the Central Asian populations and may lose the governments in Central Asia as well, which have been outspoken against the war in Ukraine. While Russia has lost its ground, China is trying to regain or gain more ground there. And this is going to be a very interesting development. I'm sure Rafael is going to tell us a lot more about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Margarita. That is a great segue over into Raffaello. And I'm getting a picture from you of Russia that is kind of down, but not necessarily entirely out in the region. Raffaello, it'd be really interesting to hear from you about how this kind of intersects with China's approach to the region and the dynamics that you're seeing. And thank you, by the way, for joining us in the evening, your time. So.
Well, thank you, John, for the kind invitation to speak with you. And it's fascinating to hear Margarita's thoughts. And it's always a great pleasure to join Jamestown Foundation events. So you are on the polar opposite side of the world to me. So it is indeed late at night. Well, it's a lovely early morning in Washington for you all there. I will, I'll maybe pick up on where Margarita left off and say, I was very fortunate recently to go through the region. I was in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan in the past month or so. And I'm due to go back later in the month to the other countries as well. And I think what was interesting to me was how actually Russian influence, well, it's very clear that at a public level, you've seen this sort of very strong rejection and anger towards Russia that is sort of continuing to grow. And at a public level, you find a much greater sort of antipathy towards Russia in some ways than I think you necessarily had before. What's striking to me is actually, if you look at the sort of foundational economics and a lot of the other details, actually Russian influence arguably is increasing. If we're looking at trade flows, they have increased. If we're looking at Russian companies moving out of Russia into Central Asia, that seems to be increasing. If we look at remittance flows, which is of course a critical bind, an economic tie for Central Asia to Russia, where we're talking about young Central Asians. I mean, the numbers oscillate wildly. People say somewhere between 4 to 7 million Central Asians, and those are the 7 million is the definitely upper exaggerated level. Uzbeks, mostly Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Kyrgyz, who work in Russia and who send back money home to Central Asia. And in the Kyrgyz and Tajik case, it's a substantial portion of their GDP that's generated from these remittance flows. There was an expectation, I think, in the wake of the invasion that this money would suddenly disappear. It has not. In fact, we can see the need for Central Asian labor in Russia has increased, and we can see a lot more of it getting called up and called in. And so that really important economic bind has actually gotten stronger. And then at a government level, you can see that the authorities there, while they are concerned, and we can see that they're expressing this, and in particular, we've seen the Kazakh leadership say a number of things against what Russia is doing, in not veiled language in some terms, but in quite blunt language in others. We're seeing behind the scenes that actually they do seem to be continuing to engage and recognizing that Russia is a really important economic partner to them. On the China side, the interesting part is the degree to which, in some ways, Chinese engagement has continued in, I would say, much the same way as it had before. The biggest break that I think we've seen recently in Chinese relations with Central Asia was actually as a result of COVID, where we saw that the COVID restrictions in China were so dramatic and so extreme, the zero COVID policy. It essentially made trade between Central Asia and China very complicated and very difficult. And this was a huge problem for a lot of small traders in Central Asia who just couldn't get their goods back across the border, or for people who are relying on Chinese ports in Lianyungang to get their goods from across China into Central Asia and then ultimately potentially onto elsewhere. They couldn't get their goods out of the country. And so they were finding themselves in a really difficult situation of not being able to trade. And we can see that those border posts are only now starting to open up again. And in fact, I was talking to some Kazakh contacts last month, and they were even saying it hadn't opened yet, or it hadn't completely opened yet. So we're still seeing that sort of fallout happening. And so in many ways, the story of kind of China surging in, I don't think it's quite happened yet as far as I can see. It seems to be a story of China is sort of continuing to be the sort of power that's growing and the economic force that's increasing in the region, but it hasn't sort of surged. And I think a large part of that is because we're still seeing a recovery from COVID, but also I think it's because we are seeing a lot of sort of Russian influence on Russian economic activity kind of increasing. At the same time, having said all of that, I think the problem that Central Asia is increasingly finding itself is that its other options are more limited. If we look at the European Union, there's been a lot of discussion recently about this sort of expansion of the so-called middle corridor, which would essentially be a way of trying to open up routes across the Caspian, over to the Caucasus, then over ultimately to Turkey to get to European markets. And this would be a route which would sort of open up the region to Europe directly without having to go through a sanctioned Russia, which is of course really important in the current situation that the region finds itself in. Now, the problem with this kind of middle corridor logic is that it involves a lot of investment and a need at the other end in Europe, which isn't totally there. I mean, the idea of sort of building Trans-Caspian pipelines, or more of them, bigger Trans-Caspian pipelines, has been on the table for a very long time. It hasn't quite materialized. And it's difficult to quite see it really clicking into place quite yet. And so Central Asia finds itself in this difficult situation where it would like to reach out further through that corridor to try to get around the problems that it encounters with Russia, but is actually finding it quite difficult to do, and is not necessarily finding the reach back from Europe. And having said all of that, anyway, routes that would go across the Caspian, of course, are always going to be basically subject to a Russian or Iranian veto, which are both countries that have very little interest at the moment in making Europe's life easier, frankly. So if we're talking about energy, for example, which is the big one that people try to talk about, it would be very difficult to see, for example, Turkmen gas getting across the Caspian any quicker, frankly, than they've been talking about for a very long time. So where does China fit into all of this? Well, the interesting thing, of course, for this middle corridor is that really for this middle corridor to work, it isn't really Central Asian goods that you're talking about, but it's really Chinese goods that you're talking about that will be sort of coming out across Central Asia. And within that context, we have seen some really interesting movement, in particular on the railroad in Kyrgyzstan. This is a project which has been talked about for a very long time, the idea of creating a rail across Kyrgyzstan, which will go from China to Uzbekistan, linking up rail networks that already exist to essentially facilitate transit across that. Now, this is a project that's been on the table for well over a decade now, if not longer, and hasn't moved forwards. But it seems recently, under the Aparov government, we do seem to have some movement. Where the financing is going to come from, I haven't figured out. I've been asking a lot of people recently. The assumption seems to be China will probably bankroll it, probably Exim Bank, and the Kyrgyz will take whatever sort of loans are required to facilitate, and this project will proceed. But it seems as though we're seeing a lot more technical discussions, a lot more engineers walking and talking around on the ground to actually do feasibility studies to really see the route actually happening this time. And what's interesting in the region is that the sense is that the reason that this has finally become unlocked now is because President Putin has essentially given it the green light. Having for a long time resisted this train being developed, he's apparently told Mr. Yaparov that it can proceed, and it is as a result going to. With the Chinese have been saying they'd be happy to do it for a long time. But it does seem to be hold up. So we can see that this corridor, if this opens up, this will improve connectivity across the region and will open up, and it will also increase Chinese connections and Chinese leverage and Chinese influence across this region. And really, we'll be seeing a lot more Chinese trade, which will be able to go through this route across Central Asia without having to go ultimately through Russia, through potentially sanctioned routes. Now, of course, the other end of that route is in Xinjiang in China, which is another part of China which is actually under heavy sanction at the moment. So there is a question mark in my mind, at least, about how really what this will really open up entirely. But certainly that is the logic. And I think that's certainly what we see being talked about a lot on the ground. But at the same time, from the Chinese perspective, we've seen this particular project move forwards. But the other flip to this is we've seen, on the other hand, there's been a mixed response from Chinese business. And this was something that was particularly striking when I was in the region recently. I was talking to some Chinese entrepreneurs who are working on the ground and hearing from people who are working with Chinese companies and others. And the striking thing is that Chinese companies ultimately don't necessarily look at Central Asia as that wonderful and large an opportunity. It is ultimately a relatively small market. But what they can see is now that the Russian market has suddenly become much more open to them. And so there's a strong sense that companies that were there are increasingly actually looking up towards the Russian market, where we're seeing Western brands and Western companies leaving. And so suddenly there's a consumer demand there in Russia, which needs to be satisfied. And Chinese companies are very well placed to do that. But at the same time, there's a flip to that as well, where we can see there's other Chinese companies that have, on the other hand, started to worry about the impact of secondary sanctions and what might hit them when they're working in Russia, and actually relocating, in some cases to Central Asia, or in some cases, frankly, just sort of packing up their shops altogether. And the sort of most interesting examples I've found in this particular context, if we look at Huawei and Lenovo, who both started to move out some of their research people and some of their people who are working in Russia, moving them to Central Asia, or in some cases back to Russia, while they're still selling a lot of their white goods in the country. The sort of company people that were there operating it on the ground have sort of stepped back. And actually what we are seeing is some of that trade is moving through Central Asia. So we're seeing more of these goods being sold to Central Asia and then ultimately being sold up from that context into Russia. And the other big project, which is very interesting and fell apart in the wake of the invasion, was AliExpress Russia, which is a big project that was being undertaken by Alibaba in conjunction with the Russian Direct Investment Fund and some Alisher Usmanov companies, to basically help create a kind of Alibaba specific for Russia. Now, AliExpress is a big company that covers large parts of Europe, parts of Central Asia, parts of the Caucasus, and Russia. But the idea of AliExpress Russia was to essentially create a kind of local version of this, with a whole sort of logistics infrastructure that goes with it. And Alibaba had poured a lot of money into this, alongside these other Russian companies, to start to develop this. And what happened in the wake of the invasion in February was they had a board meeting, which Alibaba essentially announced that they're not going to put any more money into this project. And in fact, they might start to look to divest. And since that, it's been essentially a project that's been in slow decline. Now, this is very interesting, of course, because this shows that there is this mixed response, where on the one hand, we can see that Chinese companies are seeing great opportunities that they're surging in to take advantage of. But on the other hand, we're seeing they're hesitating and pulling back in some contexts as well, which I think reflects a kind of duality and a complexity to the kind of Russia-China relationship. How does this relevant for Central Asia? Well, it sits in between. And ultimately, unfortunately, Central Asia gets stuck in the vicissitudes of how the China-Russia relationship goes. And I think that will bring me maybe to the final point that I'll sort of come to here, which is, I think a lot was made of the fact that President Xi, or I think it was Wang Yi actually, sorry, soon after the recent summit between President Putin and President Xi, announced that China is going to hold another Central Asia plus China format meeting. Now, I personally am quite surprised that there was so much hoo-ha around this. This is not the first time this format has taken place. It first took place in 2020, and I think it took place again in 2022, if I recall correctly, though this was during the pandemic, so ultimately it was just an online format. But the C5 Plus format is also not a new one. I think the Japanese did the first one all the way back in 2004. The US has been running it now for a few years. But so, you know, in some ways, I would just say this is a continuation. This is the first in-person one for the Chinese, because, of course, under the pandemic, they couldn't do this. So they're all going to go and group in China. But I think the more critical point for this that I would say is that the bigger issue that I thought was relevant for Central Asia to take away from the Xi and Putin summit was the fact that we saw a direct mention of China and Russia coordinating in Central Asia in the joint communique that came out at the end of the summit. Now, this in itself is not totally new. We've seen China and Russia talk about Central Asia, but I'm not sure we've ever seen them quite so explicitly say it in a joint communique of this sort at the end of a big summit, talking about coordinating in Central Asia. And this, I think, is something that is really quite worrying to Central Asians, because from their perspective, the concern is that the room they have to maneuver, the kind of multi-vector foreign policy that they love to champion and talk about, as their ability to kind of balance between these big powers that sort of sit around them, becomes much harder if the two biggest ones that engulf you geographically are basically in close lockstep together in a tight alliance, which frankly is about the West and confronting the United States and its Western partners. You know, if they're making that point very clearly, and that was the big takeaway, I think, from the Putin-Xi summit, that these two clearly want to be seen on the world stage as being very close partners and allies, then that makes it very difficult for Central Asia to try to play them off each other. And, you know, it was very striking when we saw the visit by President Xi after you know, his first out-of-country visit after COVID, where he went to Central Asia in Kazakhstan. And one of the big messages that came out of a lot of attention was given to the fact that while he was in Kazakhstan, he talked about, you know, defending Kazakh sovereignty and how China would defend Kazakh sovereignty. Well, I think that went down very well publicly, but I know, you know, at a government level in Central Asia and Kazakhstan in particular, I think there was a lot of skepticism. They recognized the fact that actually, if you look at what President Xi has said about Ukraine, he's used very much the same kind of terminology. He said, you know, well, we respect and value Ukraine's sovereignty. Well, I don't think you need to be sat in Kiev to recognize that, in fact, that sort of declaration doesn't necessarily have the same weight and force behind it that you might hope. And so I think there's a realization that, you know, China's not going to be the one that's going to protect them from Russia. And actually, China and Russia are increasingly getting closer and closer in lockstep together in their alliance against the West. The only codicil I'll add to this at the very end, sorry, is just to say we also need to not confuse this close alliance to mean that they'll agree on everything. You know, it's very clear that there are lots of divergences and differences in view between China and Moscow, between Beijing and Moscow, on the ground in Central Asia and in other contexts as well. And the only point I'd say is there's lots of global alliances that are like that. The United States and Europe do not get along on a lot of things, but at the same time, I don't think we ever doubt NATO's, you know, coherence, and I don't think we doubt the tightness of the transatlantic alliance in confrontation on a lot of things. And I think that's the way we need to think a little bit more about the China-Russia relationship. They've clearly aligned themselves in a way against the West, and that's the primary thing kind of binding them together. But within that context, there are lots of problems that they have in Central Asia and elsewhere. But I don't think that we're going to start to see those being fissures that are really going to pull them apart. So I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Rafael. Those are some fantastic insights. And yeah, one of the questions I had coming into this event was, how much do Central Asian countries see Russia and China as working hand in glove, and how much do they see them as alternatives to one another? And you kind of got me thinking about that. So thank you. I want to open this to audience questions. We actually have a question right off the bat from our president, Glenn Howard. And I think this is a great question, basically asking, did Moscow, you know, relent on this sort of longstanding opposition to the railroad because of Chinese, you know, support or in Ukraine? Do you think there's any connection there, Rafael?
I think it's a really interesting and difficult question. I think it seems, it seems clear that the Kyrgyz leader, President Yaparov, did say, that President Putin gave the green light to this to him personally. He did some interview, I can't remember where it was, where he said, Vladimir Vladimirovich has said, we can proceed with this, so we can now proceed with this. Was that a nod to China? It's very difficult to know. It's quite possible, but I would argue it probably, from a Russian perspective, had two audiences, if you will. And I think one of them was, frankly, the Central Asians as well. And I mean, to go back to, some of the points Margarita made about the region, well, as I say, I actually think the Russian grip has gotten a bit tighter in some ways. There is a lot of public animosity. It's interesting to see, for example, the amount of diplomacy we've seen by Russia going towards Turkmenistan. We've seen a lot of visits to Turkmenistan by senior Russian figures, which is surprising, sort of a surprisingly large amount of late. And it seems to be they're trying to really win over the Turkmen. And we can see in other countries in the region as well, we have seen a bit more effort going into it from President Putin's perspective. So it could be that it's also that. It was about trying to sort of keep the Central Asians on side to some degree, recognizing that they are in a kind of precarious position. Whether he was worried that they would go towards the West or go towards China, I don't know. I personally don't know how worried he would actually be about them going towards China, because I think at the end of the day, I don't know that he worries that the Chinese is going to turn the Central Asians on him in a way. But I do think that, I think it was probably a nod to some degree to China, but I think it was also a nod to the Central Asians in a way, and a way of kind of tightening his grip and showing, yes, I do still have kind of veto power over these things, so I will let this one happen. And that's his way of kind of winning over a little bit there. So I think it kind of had a double-edged thing. And I'm sure his calculations were in part informed by the very sharp response he's seen to his invasion of Ukraine from the West.
And also, I think that the Road and Belt Initiative, the roads going through Russia, from China to Russia, are in big trouble with these investments as good as frozen right now. They're not going to be able to export through Russia for a long time. Things may get pretty dicey, and the sanctions may tighten. And China realizes this. So probably it was one of the concessions that the China received from Russia to develop alternative routes through Central Asia in order to compensate them for the trouble that they are having with the northbound routes.
Great. All right. Well, let me open this further up to questions, and you can ask a question, I guess, in two ways: just typing it in the question box, or raising your virtual hand if you want to ask it in person. And let's go now to a question from Richard Weitz at Hudson Institute. It's a great question. What can the West do to enhance Central Asian countries' autonomy, the autonomy of countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that are seeking more freedom to maneuver between China and Russia? So Rafael, you just talked about kind of the decreasing maneuvering room as that relationship tightens. Margarita, let's start with you here. Based on your recent visit to Kazakhstan, what do you think they can do, and maybe what are they already trying to do?
The support of the United States is very obvious for Kazakhstan's sovereignty and independence, of the European Union as well. There are plans for solid, large investments by the European Union, particularly in the renewable energy sector of Central Asia. There are commitments by big companies in Europe to do so. So this is one way, is the assistance to develop alternative energy sources, which has double purpose. One is to make the region more self-sufficient. The other one is to counter climate change this way. But also the help that is expected and to some extent lended to the development of the middle corridor. And the middle corridor, although it never is going to have the capacity of the routes that are going, corridors that are going through Russia, it still has a very significant strategic role to play. We can see now that Azerbaijan has built a special terminal for fertilizers from Central Asia, because the potential of Central Asia to develop to produce its own fertilizers and export them to the West, especially in the shortages that the world experienced in fertilizers since the war started last year in February, is very significant. And this can help also not only Central Asia economically, but also alleviate to some extent the world shortages of certain goods. The same is valid about foods. We know Kazakhstan is a big producer of grains, and that can be expanded. Actually, the harvest is being better in the last couple of years, and that is expected to expand and export to different countries to also help in the grain shortages that the world has experienced. So these are big stakes that the West has there, and help in these two directions, fertilizers, grains, and the third one, energy, is going to help not only the region, it's going to help the world. And I think that many in Europe and United States are pretty clear that this needs to happen. Of course, the West is becoming engaged in very important other parties, the nuclear production. We know Kazakhstan is the largest producer of uranium in the world. Unfortunately, all this uranium is being enriched in Russia and exported through Russian ports via St. Petersburg. That can become a problem and lead to shortages of uranium fuel as we are developing more nuclear power stations or small nuclear reactors in the future for the transition to clean energy. So that helping Kazakhstan develop enrichment facilities is another step that the West can be helpful, because if they don't, China is going to take over this function, and then the export of nuclear fuel is going to be dependent entirely on China the way it is dependent on Russia at the moment.
Great. Raffaello, anything to add there on Central Asian states maneuvering?
Sure. I mean, look, I'd say I'd agree 100% with Margarita on the middle corridor. You know, I think that it's never going to replace the other things, but actually, if it existed and was more substantial and it grew, and you know, as you very correctly points out, some of the infrastructure is in place, but there's some which is not. I think making sure that does actually happen, because I think there's a real concern that the only reason we're seeing attention on it now is because of the war in Ukraine. And if something should change in that context, whether the war ends or the war freezes in some way, suddenly maybe that won't become attractive anymore. And I think continuing to make sure it does means that should something happen in the future, we won't get to this situation again. But as Margarita points out, it's not going to be a replacement, but it will give a few more options. And that's, I think, the critical thing that the region wants and needs. The other thing I'd say is be more present. You know, I mean, I am a British national, as you can tell from my accent. You know, our foreign secretary just visited. I think it's the first time a foreign secretary's been in a very long time to the region. Secretary Blinken visited relatively recently. I think that was his first trip to the region. I think I understand that when some of the leaders came over for UNGA, they did try to see him. He didn't make time for them. I know he's a busy man, but my point is, you know, you do have to kind of show up. You know, and you do have to kind of engage, and that's important. And I think if you're not going to, then that's a sense. And because at the moment the region is still, of course, reeling from the American evacuation from Afghanistan and the consequences of that, you know, which wasn't a very good look in terms of showing a sense of consistency from the US in particular. So I think there's something that needs to be done there from the US at a very, you know, very senior, frankly, diplomatic level, to kind of be present and be active and be engaged, you know, and continue to do that. And that is unfortunately not something that gets fixed overnight. It takes, frankly, years of just showing up, continuing to show up and continuing to engage and demonstrating that. And the Europeans, the same thing can be said, frankly. We have seen a kind of spurt of European attention, but, you know, European attention, as far as I can tell, it seems to go in cycles of attention and then disinterest, attention and disinterest. We seem to be in a phase of attention at the moment, but I think everyone in the region is expecting it's going to slump back into disinterest at some point. So, you know, again, maintaining that kind of engagement, being present, engaging, I think is a really important element to it. The other elements I'd say are probably a bit more kind of technical. I think one is, you know, I think everyone recognizes that the region has lots of problems in terms of the kind of economic environment, in terms of problems around corruption and other issues. But there have been a lot of reforms, and there have been a lot of changes over the years. You know, if I think to the first times I went to now, basic things in the work in the daily life that you can see around you have definitely changed. You know, sort of street corruption is kind of down. You know, the sort of vast discrepancies that you have between the official conversion rates and the unofficial currency rates has changed in a lot of countries. So there has been a lot of work that's gone into trying to reform and improving the kind of rule of law. I think recognizing that would be important, because that would have another effect, which is to help businesses, because really what this region wants is other businesses to come in. It doesn't want to have essentially Chinese or Russian companies being the alternatives that they have, potentially Turkish, potentially Iranian. They want Western companies, they want European, they want American companies to come and be interested. Now, it's understandably not necessarily the most attractive market because of its distance and size, but there are some niche opportunities that exist there, and encouraging those and recognizing some of the reform processes have moved in a positive direction would help sort of encourage that a little bit as well. And then the final piece I'll say, which I think is really important in terms of helping the region in the longer term develop, is education. There is a real deficit in these countries. You've got very young populations, and you've got education systems which frankly aren't constructed to educate all these people. And I think, you know, there's a lot that could be done in the kind of education space in particular to try to improve and upskill the communities. And through doing that, you will create a sort of more dynamic community, and a community which frankly create options for itself. And I think that's really the key part of this. You know, if the region is able to kind of, you know, figure out what it wants to do and control its relationships with these big powers, then that I think would be the ultimate goal that the West should be going for.
And particularly now when big companies in both Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are up for privatization, and this is kind of the height of the largest companies that we've seen, and the largest number of companies that we see slated for privatization, I think it's a really good moment for engagement in investment in the region, if the security risks are ruled out. And in many ways, despite the fact that Russia has been threatening Kazakhstan in particular several times, we remember what happened in January in 2022 when Russia sent CSTO troops to Kazakhstan to help with the revolt, with the violence that was taking place in some of the biggest cities. China was not happy about it. China said, we could have helped too. We could have helped in this providing security too. So in a way, as much as the region may face potential trouble and even civil war in Russia in the future, and more threats coming from Russia to Central Asian governments that are not supporting Moscow, we have China on the other side, and ironically, this is a security protection as well. Just the mere fact that China has its own business interests, its own security interests. Central Asia is a bridge for China to Europe, and that is not going to be easily forfeited to satisfy Moscow's interests.
Great. Well, this, I think, sets us up nicely to talk about one of China's longstanding security interests in the region, which also ties in with the domestic situation in Xinjiang and the repression against the Uyghur population there. You know, we know a longstanding concern. Daria Novak asks, how concerned is China right now? Not necessarily about Central Asian governments, but maybe the Central Asian populations influencing the Uyghur population. Raffaello, maybe you can chime in on this one?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think that, you know, worrying about networks and groups of dissident Uyghurs gathering in Central Asia or Afghanistan or Pakistan or further afield is a kind of major Chinese concern in general. I think within the Central Asian context, you know, maybe with the exception of Kyrgyzstan, I think there's a sense that they've kind of got it under control, in the sense that, you know, the local governments are quite happy to go after groups that the Chinese are worried about. And I think they have consistently in the past and quite happily said so, because from their perspective, these are kind of anti-state elements that are doing naughty things against a neighbor, and that's kind of the end of it. In terms of the sort of influence element that you talk about, I mean, one of the more sad elements, I would argue, of my experiences traveling around the region is I've actually found very little sympathy in most Central Asian countries. I'd say Uzbekistan is probably the exception to this. In general, people are hear what happens to the sort of Uyghur community in China, and they think it's not a nice situation, but an awful lot of them, I think, broadly say, well, they are Chinese citizens. That is their country. I'm sorry, and that's often the sense I get. I think in Uzbekistan, you do seem to have a wider pool of kind of public discourse who get angry and talk about Uyghurs. And you can see this through, I've been doing some work with some Central Asian researchers recently looking at kind of online discourse, in particular in the media. And you can see there is a chat around Uyghurs that you find in Xinjiang, what's happening there, you find in Uzbekistan, you don't really find it in the other places. Does this actually impact things in China? Not much, as far as I can tell, to be perfectly honest with you. I think it's a pretty big firewall that the Chinese have managed to erect between those two.
Great. Yeah, maybe places like Syria or elsewhere might possibly greater concerns. But all right, let's turn now to a question from Gilbert Rosman. I think this is for you, Margarita. Has Russia shifted its thinking on the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? It's sort of a joint Sino-Russian initiative. Do they has it changed, I guess, with the war in Ukraine?
I think Russia has very few choices today. The sanctions are making these choices limited to China, to India, and to Central Asia and several other Asian countries. They are not having export corridors of energy to Europe anymore. Europe does not buy Russian oil, except for a few countries that were exempt from the sanctions. And Europe does not buy Russian gas, again, except for 2 or 3 countries that still receive Russian gas. So where does this go? China has increased purchases of Russian oil and gas. India has tremendously increased purchases of Russian oil and gas. But this gas and oil it needs to go through somewhere. And the seaborne is one way, but through Central Asia is the other way. So that, in a way, is protecting Central Asia from Russia, from Russian aggression, because Central Asia is needed now as a conduit to transit oil from Russia to China and gas from Russia to China, or do swap operations on oil and gas. But at the same time, China cannot benefit from BRI, what is now in Russia, investments in Russia, and they are concerned that the situation may get worse. If Russia continues the war in Ukraine, if more war crimes are committed, if Europe is becoming more and more independent in terms of energy, Russia may be under sanctions for a very long time to come. And if that happens, then China, has to figure out other ways to export to Europe. On the other hand, CSO cannot be influenced by Russia as much as it used to be in the past, even to a limited extent. And it will continue benefiting China. China's links to Central Asia now are very important. And the fact that we have more increased trade now from Russia, China, Russia, Central Asia. I think it's a temporary situation, mostly due to the fact that it's muddy waters, and everybody is benefiting when waters are muddy, and they find other agreements with different players. And it's also expression of the fact that Russia has fewer options. This is why Central Asia is becoming, especially Kazakhstan, a net exporter to Russia, of goods from Kazakhstan to Russia, and also goods that they receive from other countries to be sent through the economic union to Russia. How long this is going to continue? Is this going to be affected by further sanctions, by secondary sanctions, by more monitoring? Kazakhstan is doing everything possible to prevent secondary sanctions, but of everything, of washing machines from the West going in thousand times more now than before, going to Kazakhstan and from there to Russia, or Georgia is another example, also sending to Russia. We don't know how this is going to play in the future, but Russia has, bottom line is Russia has really few options, which benefits Central Asia, certainly on the short term, and we'll see about the long term in the future.
Great. Let's talk a little bit about the Belt and Road from the Chinese side, maybe, because is Central Asia, we know that Chinese lending is down and that China is dealing with its own fiscal challenges internally, right? So some of the sort of optimism around the BRI is faded in some regions, but in other regions it's still quite high. I talked to colleagues in Pakistan, and they're still very excited about BRI. So, Raffaello and Margarita, is Central Asia gonna sort of buck this trend and, still, be kind of a centerpiece of BRI? Obviously, there's the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing, likely later this year. And the region, is the launching point for Belt and Road Initiative. But of course, the initiative has now become global, and there's all these other kind of competing demands and also fiscal issues in China. So, what's the feeling about BRI in the region? Optimism, kind of mixed, or negative?
I mean, I'll maybe start. I think it's it continues, frankly. I don't think it's gone away. I think it was born in Central Asia in many ways. I mean, I think there's a reason that President Xi gave the speech in 2013 in Astana, in Nazarbayev University. I think there was a reason for that, because the Silk Road Economic Belt, as he articulated it, which then was joined a month later by the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road in Jakarta, which becomes then the Belt and Road Initiative, going through a few name formulations in between. It was, there's a reason he started in Central Asia, because essentially what he was talking about doing, and what he was talking about through the Silk Road Economic Belt and ultimately the Belt and Road, was what had been happening in Central Asia for arguably a decade before that. It was this idea of, trying to basically open up Xinjiang, trying to make Xinjiang more connected. And actually, this goes back even deeper into kind of Chinese thinking. If you go back and look at Jiang Zemin, who had his own develop the West strategy, which was essentially recognizing that, a lot of the boom economic prosperity has happened in China on the coast, right? It's those coastal cities where all the money is and all the concentration. And you go inland and you're dealing with very, very different, places, very poor, which just haven't had the same level of development. And so the idea of the kind of Belt and Road initially was, born out of trying to build these kind of routes out across this Eurasian heartland to try to help this part of China become more prosperous. So from a Chinese perspective, that logic hasn't gone away. It's still there, it's still important. And those projects will still preponderate. Also, the projects we're talking about aren't ones you do overnight. If you're going to build a railroad, it takes years, many years, and it takes a lot of money, and it takes a lot of time, a lot of planning. And so this is not a kind of on-off switch. The only final point I'd say about the Belt and Road in general, and sorry, the specifics, you look at the projects, and I think, as I say, the railroad project in Kyrgyzstan, which looks like it's finally going to happen, is your kind of picture postcard Belt and Road project, and so that is going to happen. And we're going to probably see other similar sort of infrastructures projects proceeding as time goes on, and they'll get kind of caught under that Belt and Road rubric. The only final thing I say about BRI is, of course, that, since President Xi enshrined it in the Communist Party, constitution, it is now enshrined. It is kind of Chinese foreign policy thinking, and it will remain so, I think, as long as he's in power. Now, I think this new wave of kind of global security initiative, global development initiative, global humanitarian initiative, I see them as kind of evolutions of the Belt and Road as a kind of concept, sort of narrowing in on specific components which previously been kind of grouped under this big umbrella. But I don't think that means the umbrella has been put away. I think it continues on. It's just maybe less prominent in the sort of verbiage.
Great. Margarita, anything to add to that?
No, thank you. Rafael was very detailed in that. I think the Belt and Road Initiative is going to continue to be important for the Central Asian states as well. as long as the projects move forward and as long as China continues to invest in them. Otherwise, many of them have taken loans for these projects and they might be in a bit of a trouble to pay them back. So we will see how the Central Asian governments are going to deal with the policy that made them invest in a lot of infrastructure projects as well. And if they don't come to fruition, they are going to have to pay the loans without any benefit. So there is a mutual interest, I think, on Central Asian states and China to complete these projects and to use them for both Chinese goods, but also for goods from Central Asia to reach European markets.
Great, great. Yeah, I think, Rafaelo, I think that was a great, thinking your book, Sinostan, is a really good look at, the title, The Inadvertent Empire of Belt, and that kind of evolving into Belt and Road. So encourage everyone to take a look at that.
Thank you for that plug, John. If I see sales spike, I will be sure I know where to send the percentage.
Absolutely. So, well, this, this has really been informative to me and helped me kind of shape my thinking about the region. I still did want to ask about GSI and Global Development Initiative, but maybe I'll reach out offline to kind of talk about that. But this has been really, really informative. And thank you both for taking your time. I guess I'll plug our next event, which is actually next Tuesday at 9:30 a.m. And we'll be looking at another area where China's been taking a more active role, which is the Middle East, and unpacking the Saudi-Iran deal. So encourage everyone to register for that. You can also, if you missed any of the webinar today, you can view it on YouTube or jamestown.org. Encourage you to also check out Margarita's writings in Eurasia Daily Monitor or other authors in China Brief as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining today and spending part of your morning with us.
Thank you, John.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you.